Hi, everyone. Hopefully, everyone else can hear me. As Vidley said, I've been doing performance-related things for over 10 years now. And I'm not actually a developer. Before getting into performance, my background was in user experience and usability design and doing user testing. So I started off with just kind of this real extreme front end, as I tell people, interest in how people actually use the web and what does that actually feel like in real terms. And so when kind of the whole performance industry kind of came about, and I think I was kind of in somewhat the early days of it, I was just really interested in, well, we talk a lot about web speed and how fast pages render and things like that, and how we measure that in kind of these very developer oriented terms. But what does that actually mean in real user terms, and what are the impacts on user behavior and just how people feel? So I've been doing this for quite a while, and I have talked a lot about why performance matters in a lot of different contexts over the years. And so when Vitaly and all the other lovely folks at Smashing asked me to do this talk, I thought, okay, well, how can I make this fresh? Not just for myself, but for people who have might also been in this space, also accessible for people who are new to this space, and also kind of relevant to the world that we live in now, because the world we live in now, especially now after the past year and a half, is really different from the world that we lived in 10 years ago with regard to the internet and a lot of other things. So I really kind of gave myself the task of thinking, why does performance matter now more than ever? Oops, let me see. Sorry, it's still kind of early for me. So I'm in British Columbia. I'm a little bit slow in the mornings. Okay, so this is me. As Vidley said, I work at Speed Curve, where we help a lot of people make their sites fast and figure out what their performance issues might be. Oops. And if you do need to reach me and have any questions, and I hope you do, some questions or feedback about anything that I've talked about today, you can find me on Twitter. We're going to be saving all the questions for the end of Smashing Meets. So just for the sake of kind of keeping things moving along, but I'm pretty easy to find online. Um, I'm usually better at using my keyboard than this. There we go. So this is where I live in British Columbia. You wouldn't be able to find it unless I drew it for you on a map, but I live in a little ski town. And I only recently got high-speed internet, so my world has changed a lot in the past year, in a good way, thank goodness, because definitely fast internet was not something that I got to enjoy consistently in the 9 years that I've been living in the kind of middle of nowhere, as some people think of it. And as I mentioned, I've been doing performance things for a long time. I wrote a book for O'Reilly called The Business Value of Web Performance, where I kind of focus on business metrics. And I help curate a website that you can find at WPO Stats, which is just a collection of case studies around performance and how performance has measurably affected really important business metrics, from user engagement to conversion rate to SEO. So if you're interested in case studies that are kind of relevant to your business or your interests, I definitely recommend going to WPO Stats and giving it a little look around. And I'm going to be referencing some of these case studies later on. And I also manage a benchmark site that's a free tool, speedcurve.com/benchmarks. You can go to it. You don't need to log in or anything like that. And it actually indexes on a regular basis the top 10 or so sites in a variety of different industries, as you can see kind of across the top of this dashboard: auto, finance, media, retail, tech, and travel, in Europe, Japan, and the US. And you can toggle and kind of see like how do these sites render on fast devices, fast desktop kind of connections, versus slow mobile devices. And it can be a really interesting way to kind of just get some visibility to how other sites are doing and how does your own site kind of stack up. So kind of let's back up a little minute and talk about, what do we mean by web performance? So when we talk about web performance, when I talk about web performance, what I really mean is it loading? Is the site loading? How fast is it loading? Can I use it yet? How quickly does it feel like I can use it? And how does it feel when I'm using it? Is it janky? Do elements kind of roll around? Does the page kind of lag partway through rendering? Do ads pop up? So it's all of these different factors that can kind of come into play when we talk about web performance. When I first started out in this industry, web performance was a much cruder metric. It was pretty much the only metrics most people were focused on were how long does a page take to load. And pages were smaller then, and pages loaded, usually in 6 or 7 seconds, maybe 10 seconds. And that was kind of a crude metric that we looked at. Now, of course, we have a lot more metrics that we can look at. And I'm going to be referring to some of those throughout this talk as well. There is a good possibility that some of you are here because you've heard about these three metrics, core web vitals, and the fact that they suddenly have a really big impact or potentially big impact on how your site performs in terms of SEO for Google. So, kind of when the Wall Street Journal writes about something, it's like, whoa, the Wall Street Journal is writing about web performance. That's kind of a big deal. So when they talk about Google search ramping up penalties for slow, annoying websites, what they're talking about is the fact that these web vitals have been absorbed into the algorithm that Google uses for page ranking. So again, when we talk about core web vitals, and I'll talk a little bit more about these later as well, what we're talking about is these three metrics, which kind of correlate back to these questions that I ask. Is it loading? Can I use it? How does it feel? So largest contentful paint, it's kind of when does that largest painted element happen on the page? Is the page loading? First input delay, how long does a page take to respond to a user input? That's kind of that interactivity question. And then cumulative layout shift, which is how kind of janky does the page feel? How stable is the page? So those are three really important metrics, just in the sense that they've given us something to corral around. It's turned into a bit of a wild west. You can track dozens, hundreds, possibly metrics on a given page, depending on maybe how many third parties you have. And it was really a great initiative by Google to kind of focus people back into kind of core principles. What do we actually care about when we talk about performance? And it's not to say you shouldn't care about those other metrics, but if you're just starting out with performance, this is a good place to start. So let's go back here for a second. So it's obviously important in the world that we live in to make Google happy. We all know that. And it's really easy whenever you kind of have your managers or other people in your teams kind of saying like, SEO, Google, to kind of think that that's your whole world. But in fact, I would ask you to consider the fact that performance isn't just about making Google happy. In 2016, the UN declared that the internet, access to the internet, is a basic human right. And for me, I come at performance, as I said, from a usability and user experience background. This has always been kind of my fundamental interest: is how do we make the internet accessible and easily usable to everyone who needs to use it? And earlier, when I talked about the fact that the world has changed a lot since I started working in performance in 2009, the landscape is changed. People are using a broader variety of connection types and a broader variety of devices, some of them quite old. And the types of people who are using the internet are a broader type of people. I mean, I've been using the internet for 25 years, and certainly anyone else who's been using it for a long time knows that the user demographic for the internet used to be a very, very small cohort of a certain type of person. And now it's no longer that. It's kind of blown open, and that's a wonderful thing. Poor performance really hurts so many people, as I kind of referred to. It hurts people who live in rural areas. It hurts people in indigenous communities around the world, people with lower incomes, children, seniors, people with accessibility challenges, and people in developing countries. Years and years ago, I captured this quote that was on kind of one of the earliest mainstream articles about web performance. It was in the New York Times that I read, and this I think was 2012, 2011, maybe even in the New York Times. I can't. The New York Times has made this article disappear, but this is the quote. And I'm going to read it just in case any of you at home are on a smaller screen and can't read this text. I'm going to read it with a little bit of dramatic impression here. Oh, pity the hyper impatient web generation. Such busy lives with so many important things to do, like post the latest dribble onto their Facebook pages or download the YouTube viral video of the day. Oops, sorry, of the minute. And so clearly there's a lot of snark that's kind of, imbued in this. And maybe this was sort of the case when this article came out, or at least this was the impression of who a typical internet user, web user was back then. But now I would kind of say, if I heard somebody say something like that, I would tell them that their digital privilege is showing. And I know privilege is, some people might say that's an overused phrase. I think we can't use it enough, at least until all the playing fields are level. So when I talk about digital privilege, I'm talking about people who think that websites are performant enough just because they're performant enough for themselves. And certainly we've all been guilty of this. As soon as something works for us, it's fine. We fixed it. Problem solved. Move on to the next thing. And so what performance really wants you to do is to think beyond yourself and beyond your own experience. Because the internet isn't fast for everyone. According to Pew Research, a study from a few years ago, roughly 1 in 4 rural residents say that access to high-speed internet is a major problem in their area. And if you look at this breakdown and you see that a large cohort also says it's a minor problem, and you add those numbers together, we're looking at almost 60%, also almost 2/3 of rural residents have some issues with high-speed internet. And I don't know if any of you have ever lived in a rural area, as I do currently, or semi-rural area. When your internet is slow, it doesn't just make sites slow, it makes some sites just not work. I will sit on my phone on my dodgy connection and just watch a site just fail to perform completely because my internet, my connection can't handle it. So it's really important to remember that. So kind of going back to that, 1 in 4 rural residents, there are about 60 million people in the US who live in rural areas. That means 15 million people in the US alone experience these issues or have this lack of access to high-speed bandwidth. 1 out of 3 homes in the US do not have broadband access at all. And so broadband here defined by the FCC is 25 megabits per second down, 3 up. That's not great. And I would even argue that, so a lot of the reporting that's done or that has been done to the FCC, believe it or not, for the past 10 years or so, when this reporting has been done, these reports come out from the FCC, it's actually not done by residents. It's not done by the people who use the internet. It's done by the telecom providers, which is a little bit like leaving the wolves in charge of the chicken coop. So when recently, in the past couple of years, the FCC has kind of taken that away and started to actually explore how does the internet actually perform for people, it kind of reveals a very different picture. And this is kind of part of what's being revealed. So again, looking at 1 out of 3 homes in the US do not have broadband. That's 45 million homes. And according to the same study, that's about 12 million children who are affected by this lack of sufficient, adequate internet access. Many of these kids are now learning remotely, as we all know. My kids, even in Canada, we did a large spell of having to homeschool, and having good internet access, especially shared access when you have 2 adults suddenly working from home, 2 or more kids working from home, all of them needing to do video calls and access Google Classroom and use all the other apps that we need to use. It really, really, really hurts. This is kind of part of what's come out now that the FCC, as I said, has kind of wrestled control back of reporting who has access and the quality of that access. This quote really kind of jumped out at me. even before the pandemic, all these statistics might have been shocking. Now it's the difference between whether millions of school children can attend classes and do their homework. And the homework gap hits harder if you're poor. Only 56% of households with incomes under $30,000 had broadband as of last February. So this really kind of jumped out at me, this idea of the homework gap. Um, we can't believe that we are supporting a society and that we believe in the future if, and I know that it sounds really soapboxy and I don't get to do this very often, so please humor me. We can't really believe that we're supporting the future if we are consciously, unconsciously supporting a type of web development and web delivery that really leaves a huge chunk of people, especially children, behind. And it all sounds really obvious when I say it, but it's really easy to forget because, as I said, we're all working, a lot of us anyways, are working still from home. We understand our own context, and it's really, really, really hard to understand other people's context, especially at scale. I kind of use the phrase empathy doesn't scale a lot, because that's really the tricky thing about understanding usability and studying web performance, is really trying to figure out how to scale your sense of empathy and understanding of other people's contexts. So some more stats I'm going to throw at you. So 75% of Indigenous communities in Canada do not have access to broadband. That's huge. What This is kind of to show you what is the advantage, what are the benefits of connectivity for a First Nations community? Well, in Canada, a community up in northern British Columbia, the province that I live in, a community just got high-speed internet a few months ago, and their chief wrote this op-ed piece for the CBC website about how having access to high-speed internet has transformed his community, especially with COVID, but just also in light of kind of larger kind of cultural and economic issues that Indigenous communities face. And if you want to find this article, it's available online, but really kind of the call outs are that this has affected them in fundamental ways. Access to education, including, kind of daily learning with elementary school students, but also higher education, entrepreneurialism for their business community, social connection with other Indigenous communities, because a lot of Indigenous communities in Canada, because of how they've been relocated, are very remote from one another. Governance, the ability to not just have governance within their community, but governance across the country, and access to really essential services like medicine, online healthcare, telemedicine. So all of these things are really, really important. And this is a quote that really kind of jumped out at me. From Chief Willie Sellers, who wrote that piece. I grew up with our community being under constant boil water advisories, and I wasn't able to safely drink water out of the tap until just a few years ago. High-speed internet feels equally life-changing. So imagine that somebody for whom, safe drinking water is being conflated with high-speed internet in terms of its ability to transform the community. That's really, really huge. And this, in Canada, today actually is a brand new statutory holiday, which is a day of observance. It's our national day for honoring truth and reconciliation. And one of the truth and reconciliation kind of pledges, or actually, sorry, I should say all of the truth and reconciliation pledges under this pledge to make things right with our Indigenous communities, are all being kind of reconciled back to, or a lot of them can be affected by how we bring technology to communities and how technology can be used to support the different promises that we've made. So I've talked a lot about networks. Obviously, I mean, unless some of you work for telecoms, probably most of your developers, ops folks, usability folks, you don't fix networks, but you do build websites. And we can't fix networks, but we can fix our pages and try to mitigate at least how the networks might be failing. So a big culprit is just the size of web pages. And I talk about this all the time, and I kind of feel like a little bit of a broken record. But according to the most recent HTTP archive scan, the average web page is still over 2 megabytes in size. And that's the average. I look at a lot of page-related test data, and I see pages routinely that are 5, 6, 7. I've seen pages 13 megabytes in size. So pages can get really, really big. And if you've got a lot of third parties or images or scripts on your page, I have seen pages that have hundreds and hundreds of different resources. And all of that size and complexity really affects people down the stream. It affects how the browsers can render the page. It affects how all of those bits and pieces get served across networks. So this is where we, as people who are at the front end, can make a difference. And I know that Addie is going to talk about that later on, and I'm looking forward to seeing his talk, so that we can kind of make the difference between people seeing this and not being able to access essential services, and being able to experience fully functioning pages. Big pages also cost users money, like in real dollars. So there's a great tool. Oh shoot, I meant to add a link to it on the site. If you look up what does my site cost, Tim Cadlick made a really great tool where you can actually enter in the URL of any page on the internet. It does kind of a synthetic crawl, and then it tells you what the price of rendering that page is according to kind of average telecom costs for different countries. And so, yay Canada, most expensive, that 2 megabyte page is going to cost me about 26 cents to according to the way that I pay for data. Awesome. But you kind of see, like, the higher costs are associated with countries like Canada, Japan, Brazil, Germany. So maybe some of these countries can kind of afford it, you might say. But it kind of takes a different, it looks like a different picture when you break it down as a percentage of gross national income. So Canada bumps way down the list, which is at 0.22% of gross national income, which still surprised me, actually. So, I would have expected us to be a little bit lower than that. So that's not awesome. But if you look at the top of the list, you look at Mauritania, Madagascar, Vanuatu, Niger, Afghanistan, all of these countries, especially at the top, like 1.41% of your daily, kind of the daily calculation of your gross national income is a lot. That's one page. So imagine, how many pages do you visit in a given day? Imagine, that it's 50, 100. So suddenly, just by looking at that 50 to 100 pages, you've basically blown through your kind of your share of your company's gross, or your country's gross national income. So, we don't think about the internet in those terms, but for other people, rationing how they use the web might be part of how they actually have to function in kind of their day-to-day lives, or just basically it makes the web kind of a non-starter for a lot of people. So that's really something I think that it's helpful to bear in mind. So as I said, if you're interested in exploring this tool yourself with your own pages, just Google how fast is my site, or sorry, what does my site cost? And I'll also try to pop it in the Slack after this call. So, or after this, sorry, I'm in Zoom land now. After this Smashing Meets. And performance isn't just about speed. And I mentioned this earlier. It's about accessibility. So page jank affects people with motor skill challenges, especially on mobile. I mean, page jank affects me, and I don't think I have motor skill challenges, but your fingers chasing something, and then you finally land on it, and then you actually clicked on the wrong thing because the page was janky, and suddenly you're being sent to the wrong page, and you got to back out. So it's really frustrating for somebody without dexterity issues. For somebody with dexterity issues, manual dexterity issues, it can be really challenging. Also, something you might not know, and that I only learned embarrassingly not that long ago, is that some screen readers and other assistive technologies may not even work until the DOM has fully loaded. So they're just waiting. And even for some assistive tech, can be blocked completely by the JavaScript on your pages. So unless you've actually done accessibility testing on your pages, you might think that you're delivering an okay page, and it's actually completely inaccessible to this large chunk of people who need to use assistive technologies to access your site. Another thing to know is that people age 65 and older are 43% slower at using websites than people under the age of 55. So there's a slowness issue. And one thing that I found really interesting in this Nielsen Norman study on usability for seniors is that unlike younger folks who, if a site is slow, they blame the site, they blame their phone, they blame their network. older people, especially kind of people in kind of the 70 and older, 75 and older group, actually more likely to blame themselves, and they just feel bad. They feel like, oh, I'm just not good at this. I'm not good at using the internet. And they don't realize it's not really anything that's within their control. It's just a certain amount of just a cognitive decline or dexterity decline that just is sort of a natural part of aging, and we're all going to be there eventually. So I've tried to make a really strong kind of human case for performance and to kind of appeal to your higher moral being. But now I'm going to kind of get into the next kind of bit where I wanted to share some of the research that I've done or that I've read or otherwise participated in over the past decade and a bit. And I kind of would loosely organize these into three different groups. So there's the kind of brain, just like what's the cognitive science behind how we perceive pages or how we perceive speed in general. Behavior, how does this make us act? And to what degree is this kind of beyond our control? And business, what impact do both these factors have on just kind of business outcomes and how people use your site and how poor performance might actually affect your bottom line? Let's start off with the brain, my favorite organ. So I always find this stat really interesting. This is based on a poll, and I've lost the reference, but I've been referring to it for so long that it's just sort of like I've absorbed it. But the average web user believes that they waste 2 days a year waiting for pages to load. So, and I think I did this math from this poll based on them saying that they believed it was like something like 11 minutes a day or something like that, each day waiting for pages to load. I don't think that's actually true. I use the internet a lot, possibly an unhealthy amount, and I don't believe I wait, 11 minutes a day for pages to load, but people believe they do. And the reason why they believe that is because the way that we perceive time does not match actual time. We perceive things as taking longer than they actually do. If you've ever waited your turn in a bathroom line and felt like the person ahead of you was taking forever, but then you went in and you were obviously super fast because you're an amazing human being and came out, chances are you weren't. This is just how your brain tricks you into perceiving speed. And then when you remember things later on, that number balloons even further. So we're really not great, or not as good as we think we are at perceiving how fast things are. And this is pretty hardwired. There's, again, this is another Nielsen Norman Group study, and they did this in 93, and then they revisited in 2010, and there were absolutely no changes over time. So the implication here is that this is pretty hardwired, that anything under 100 milliseconds, because of how we process information visually, and then how that information is kind of like parsed between the different parts of our memory, anything under 100 milliseconds feels pretty much instantaneous. We can't tell the difference between 0 and 100 milliseconds. After that, and this varies from person to person, but at around 100 to 300 milliseconds, we perceive a little bit of a delay. 300 to 1,000 milliseconds, it's like, okay, something's happening. I've got to actually kind of like work to stay focused. And then anything over a second, you're already starting to kind of flip gears and your brain wants to think about other things. And that's not because you have a bad brain. It's because you have a hungry brain and it wants information and it wants to do things for you while you're awake. And then after 10 seconds, you're likely to kind of completely context shift and abandon the task. So this is fairly hardwired. And not coincidentally, this is why 100 milliseconds, going back as far as I've been working in this industry, has always been kind of Google's stated goal for ideal load times. And I like to include this vision or this image because kind of just reminding you, like, persistence of vision is a really interesting trick. And persistence of vision is what happens under 100 milliseconds in time. We can feel like things are moving very fluidly for us, and it makes sense. Again, it's not because our brains are defective. It's because we were never designed to sit and wait for and stare at screens and wait for things to happen. Our bodies and our brains were designed to hunt and gather and milk cows and do all the other things that human beings do, and those are fluid continuous tasks where the steps flow seamlessly into one another. The fits and starts of human computer interaction are completely unnatural, and it's why at the end of the day, using computer on a terrible connection, you might feel tired and really, really crabby, and it's because our brains just weren't wired to do this. The term web stress, I wish I had coined it, I didn't. The folks at Fovians who did this study for CA Technologies did. And what they found when they had people do kind of a blind study where they were served different versions of the same site, some fast, some slow, and they hooked them up to EEG machines, and just to see like what happens in your brain whenever you experience a delay versus whenever a website is kind of functioning optimally. What they found is when things slow down, we have to work up to 50% harder. Our brains are just struggling to stay on task. So that's real effort that is absolutely notable on it via EEG devices. So this was one study. I was very fortunate in a couple of years later on being able to organize another study that was similar, kind of a similar framework. Some of the same folks who worked on that first study worked on this one. And we wanted to test the impact of introducing delays on people who were trying to do transactions using mobile devices. And so similar to the CA Technologies study, we served people the same sites, gave them the same sets of tasks to do, but some people were served slower versions, and some people were served faster versions. And what we found, again, was that frustration peaked and anywhere between 11.5% and 26% during critical stages of a browsing and checkout process. So what does this mean when it comes to behavior? So we know that needing things to be fast is a fundamental need that our brains have. But what happens when things aren't fast? So I like this image. I what I like about this is the fact that there's a woman in the background who's using her computer, and she doesn't even care that this guy. In my head I call him Carl. Sorry if your name is Carl. Carl's just like he's just gonna huck his phone, like he just does this all the time, and she just is totally over it. But I found that image when I encountered this survey that asked people, what do you do when you react to a slow mobile site? And, you know, 62% said that they behave more or less normally. They don't really do anything. But look at all these other areas where like a quarter of the people roughly said they curse at their phone. 11% said they scream at their phone. 4% said they throw their phone. And so then I kind of just did a search of like, throw your phone. And I found that image. So that's the story of that. But people react poorly depending on their anger management skills when things aren't as fast as they need them to be. Another kind of human behavior piece that I think is really interesting is when do we start to interact with a page? When do we expect that we should be able to interact with a page, or when do we feel comfortable? And so we found that in this another study that I participated in, which was studying how people interact with or engage with different image types, about 47% would start to interact with a page as soon as some text appeared. But almost just over half of the other people that we polled said that they would wait for most or all of the images to load. So they felt the page wasn't complete until all of the images had rendered. So this is the importance of image rendering. And it's why I'm really super happy that Addie's going to be talking about this later on, because it's such a critical part of how people perceive a page is working. There's also this great term called rage clicks. Again, I wish I'd invented it. I didn't. But it's basically just those clicks, and I think we've all done those, in which people are just hitting their mouse buttons or punching their phone in frustration because something's just not doing what you want it to do. And if you're interested in learning a little bit more about that, Nick Jansma and Philip Tellis did a really great talk. I've included the link down at the right-hand corner. The talk's called Measuring Continuity. And rage clicks are measurable. I'm not a developer, so I don't actually know what this means, but I thought I would put it there just to kind of prove it's a real thing. I will let you kind of chase things from there if you're so inclined. Um, and then kind of moving along to business. Um, so if none of the things that I've said so far are very compelling to you, or they are compelling to you, but maybe they're not going to be compelling to your boss and other folks on your team, it can be really handy to dive into a big bucket of case studies where we can show a very strong correlation between performance and a ton of other metrics. So the exciting thing for me whenever people tell me that is, I don't think that this kind of really applies to my site. My business is really unique. My users are very special. They love my business. They're willing to wait. That might be true, but given enough data, if you start exploring, chances are you can pretty much always find some way that performance helps or hurts your business, depending on whether it's good or bad. And these can range from bounce rate, cart size, over to user retention and brand perception, and of course, SEO. So let's kind of take a little quick whistle stop tour of some of those. So as I said, I recommend going to WPO Stats. There's so many great case studies there. If you have one of your own, you can submit it. These are all kind of user submitted case studies. And what I'm really enjoying seeing, as you can see on this kind of first page of results, is how many case studies we're starting to see that are focused on Google's core web vitals. So LCP, largest contentful paint, CLS, cumulative layout shift, and FID, which is first input delay, rated there in that top one. LCP in the second one, CLS in the third one. So it's really great, and it's because it's great when new metrics come out and we all get really excited about, like, maybe this is going to be the kind of holy grail unicorn metric that's going to give us everything that we need to understand about our sites and what we need to focus on. But it's another thing to kind of see that play out in the real world in case studies and, like, oh my gosh, focusing on this metric and making it better actually was the right metric to focus on for my site. So let's start with bounce rate. I do a lot of looking at charts like this in SpeedCurve, because this is the tool that I mostly use for measuring performance. And the really great thing about real user monitoring, where you're actually gathering real user data, is that you can correlate metrics like bounce rate against your page performance metrics like load time or start render. So this is an example of a correlation chart where you can see the kind of pink line represents bounce rate and the histogram represents the distribution of load times. And you can see that as pages got slower, kind of we're looking at around the 8-second mark, bounce rate kind of hit 80%. And this chart's a pretty gradual one. I've seen ones where the climb was a lot more steep and the differences were much more stark. But just to know that bounce rate is something that's measurable, and that you can correlate that against your different metrics like start render or load time or your web vitals is a really helpful thing to know. Conversions. These are some great kind of very public facing case studies. Walmart found that for every second of load time improvement, they had a 2% conversion rate increase. Staples took a second off their median load time, improved conversion rate by 10%. Fanatics cut their median load times by 2 seconds and almost doubled mobile conversions. So there's a lot of great, very motivating, very inspiring case studies out there around conversions. And again, looking at, just kind of going back, this type of chart, this correlation chart where we look at bounce rate versus load time, if you're tracking conversion rate, this is the kind of thing you can also create a correlation chart for looking at your performance metrics. And that can be really, really compelling. Customer retention is a really big one. It's not enough that you want your pages to be fast when people are on your site. You want it to be fast enough that when they come, that they want to come back. So a study that I participated in a long time ago, where we tracked people's behavior over 18 weeks, and we served them optimal, slightly slowed down, and much more slowed down versions of the page. What we found was that we did this over 12 weeks, and what we found was that over the 12 weeks, the people who experienced the fastest pace, the baseline, that pink line at the top, had the higher likelihood of returning, and they kept returning for the 6 weeks after we ended the experiment. But for the people who were served the slower experiences, those that green and dark blue line, we actually found that it took about 6 weeks for retention rates or return rates to start to return to what they had been at the start of the experiment. So it showed that that poor experience negatively affected people's perception of the site and their willingness to come back for quite some time afterwards, and maybe permanently drove some people away. Brand perception, this is a big one. Again, going back to the mobile EEG study that I referred to earlier, as people were leaving the study, we did an exit interview. And again, these people didn't know that they were doing a performance study. They thought they were just doing some basic usability testing where they were asked to use the site and give us feedback about just, what did you think of the site? What did you think of how it was to use, the design, that sort of thing? In no way did they think that they were there to talk about anything to do with site speed. What was really interesting was when we took all the feedback they gave us and we fed all of the adjectives they used to describe the sites and put them into word cloud generators, what we found was that the cohort of people who experienced the faster site said a whole lot of really great things about it. They said it was user-friendly, easy to use, better than others. They did say some of them did notice it was fast and quick, that it was simple and easy to buy from. So there was a lot of good stuff in there. And the larger the word, the more prevalent that was in the feedback that we got. The people who experienced the slower site said that the site was slow. They said it was basic, sluggish, tacky, clunky, boring, complicated, inelegant, frustrating, confusing. They said some nice things too, but those negative words were definitely much more prevalent in their comments. And what was really interesting was that the people who experienced a slower site talked to us longer and more about their experience of using the site. They really wanted to unload about how this site made them feel. So it wasn't just that that they perceived that the site was slow. They felt that the same site that the vast cohort of people saw was also, they didn't like the design, they didn't like the usability of it, thought it was tacky. It really bled down into their perception of everything else about the site, all the other properties. And then SEO, we've got to come back to that. Again, if you're here because of Core Web Vitals, and not saying that's not a good reason to be starting to think about performance, it definitely is. There's a really good case study that came out, I think, just last week, or at least that's when I discovered it, where a group of people shared this very detailed case study, and you can look it up at the link, where they put the site through its paces, optimized for Core Web Vitals, and what they found was the pages where, the good pages where they had implemented these improvements to Core Web Vitals ranked slightly better, 1%, than average when it came to SEO. But more importantly and more interestingly, I think, were that the slow pages suddenly ranked significantly worse than average. 3.7% might not sound like a lot. That's a lot of percent when you're looking at a lot of data. So again, why should you care? Why should you care about performance? Someday this is going to be us. Between the ages of 25 and 60, our ability to use the web declines by 0.8% a year. And again, that doesn't sound like a lot, but we're looking at 35 years. I don't know about you, I'm definitely in between 25 and 60, and I am definitely noticing my ability to do a lot of things. What basically, it starts to decline when you're 25 years old. So if you're over 25, this is already happening for you, this 0.8% decline. Your vision, your dexterity, your working memory, basically meaning your ability to kind of hold information in your head while you flip from page to page and wait for pages to render, all of those things will decline. And that's my cheerful message. Yay! Thank you very much. You can find me on Twitter at Tam Everts if you have any questions, and I will be jumping into the Slack after this to kind of say hi, and looking forward to the talks that are coming up later from Robin and Addie. Thank you so much.
All right, here we go. Excellent, Tammy. Thank you so much for the fantastic presentation. I think the way you pronounced, can you read out loudly that quote? That was incredible. That's another talent right there. So thank you so much, Tammy. I'm looking forward to chat with you a little bit later, and of course, see you in the chat as well.
Absolutely.
All right, and please give a warm round of clap emoji in the chat on Vito as well if you're joining us there too. So this in mind, Tammy, see you a little bit later.
Absolutely.